In Miami, a university football player and his female friend are found beaten to death. Investigators piece together random fragments from the crime scene, hoping to assemble evidence that will point to the killer. A man is found shot to death in his living room. With no obvious suspect, investigators turn to those closest to the victim and uncover a startling secret. When killers are driven by jealousy and desire, their desperation is evident in both the crime and their efforts to avoid detection. But forensic science can reveal even the slightest mistake. To solve crimes of passion. Sultry Miami Beach, with its hot nights and warm days, is the perfect setting for romance. But when passion is one-sided, jealousy and rage can lead to murder. On April 16, 1996, University of Miami student Darren Thomas was returning to the dormitory he shared with star linebacker Marlon Barnes. Thomas saw that the tires of his SUV were flat. He had just loaned the car to his roommate. Annoyed, he wanted to confront him. When he went into the dorm, Thomas was horrified to find Barnes lying on the floor, covered in blood. He ran next door to call police.
Miami-Dade County Police and Fire, where's your emergency? University of Miami? What building number? Room number?
A patrol officer and an ambulance were immediately dispatched to the apartment.
Attention all units, 332, University of Miami Athletic Dorm. It's unknown if there's a subject on the scene at 1901, Kilo 3105.
Paramedics entered the scene. Marlon Barnes lay motionless on the floor.
Do you have a pulse?
He'd been severely beaten about the head and face. He was pronounced dead at the scene. In the bedroom, the officer found another victim.
There's a female down, detectives.
A young woman, also badly beaten. Despite efforts to revive her, the victim's vital signs remained weak. Medics needed to get her to a hospital immediately. Crime scene investigators arrived and began to carefully search through the apartment, looking for clues. It was eerily undisturbed, suggesting that robbery was not a motive for the attack. Investigators found splinters of wood and shards of metal near the front door. But the wood pieces did not seem to match any of the furniture in the apartment. It may have come from the murder weapon. They also found fragments of teeth and bone, testaments to the savagery of the attacks. Investigators interviewed Darren Thomas. he identified the female victim as 22-year-old Timwanika Lumpkins. Unfortunately, she too would not survive. Barnes had borrowed his SUV to attend a party at a Miami nightclub. He was not aware of anyone who would want to attack Barnes or Timwanika. At the Miami-Dade Police Department, Detective Thomas Romani worked the case. From his early assessment of the crime scene, Romani knew the victims were caught by surprise.
We were able to establish that the attack was with a heavy blunt object, and it took place right at the front door and proceeded into the house, and the majority of the trauma sustained to Barnes occurred when he was on the floor.
The victims were autopsied in Dade County. The examination revealed that both victims died as a result of blunt trauma. Barnes and Timwanika had been hit with such force that impressions of the murder weapon were left on their bodies. Medical examiner Sam Galino noted the distinctive nature of the victim's wounds.
Marlon's wounds were predominantly clustered around his face. Some of them were T-shaped or L-shaped, or had some unusual contours to them that made me think that they were made with some sort of very specific weapon. Timwanika had some pattern injuries, but they were subtle and they were different, indicating that either it was a different weapon, a different aspect of the same weapon, or possibly that the weapon had somehow altered, such as being broken between when she was assaulted and when Marlon was assaulted. But the bigger mystery in both of the cases was there a specific weapon that we could identify and match to these wounds?
The task of identifying the murder weapon would fall to the Miami-Dade Crime Lab. Thomas Quirk is a firearms and tool mark examiner at the lab. He studied evidence taken from the scene.
I could tell by looking at the wood that it looked like what's called a fore-end of a shotgun. That is a part of the shotgun that's usually held by the left hand when somebody's firing a shotgun.
The brutality and rage of the crime suggested the killer knew his victims. The next day, news of the campus tragedy stunned the city. Detectives would have to develop leads on a suspect. Investigators met with the victim's close friends and teammates. Barnes and Timwanika were popular and well-liked by their peers.
Barnes and Lumpkins. I saw them at the Club Salvations.
The football players told us that Barnes and Timwanika were seen together. Not all of the football players knew their exact relationship. Timwanika was a friend of Marlon Barnes since they were in high school.
Miami-Dade police also discovered that Timwanika had an ex-boyfriend, a rap musician named LeBrant Dennis.
LeBrant Dennis was a local of Miami. He had produced some rap videos, and in fact, that's how Timwanika and LeBrant Dennis met.
Police were eager to question Timwanika's ex-boyfriend, LeBrant Dennis. And they wouldn't have to wait long for answers. The day after the murder, Dennis and a friend showed up at the police station.
And their boyfriend. I need you to research through that, see what you can make out of it.
The ex-boyfriend of the girl was murdered, LeBron, he's outside, he wants to talk to you.
Oh, good, very good. Okay. You come out there with me. Very good.
Detective Romani was intrigued by what he found out.
When I met with him, he didn't have that gangster, rough rap type persona, and I didn't pick up on it. LeBron was very calm. He was inquisitive as to what occurred. He told me that he didn't have any information about the case. Had you ever had any problems in your relationship with Tanganyika, domestic problems? He gave me some background information about his relationship with Tanganyika, why they broke up. He, in fact, told me that he did not personally know Marlon Barnes. Had you and Tanganyika
Dennis and Tanganyika dated for 5 years.
Up until a week ago, we moved out of our
There had been some breakups between them through their 5-year relationship as well.
But according to Dennis, things were getting better between them.
Out of your cousin's house?
Yeah.
They were in the process of reconciling.
We worked in the same place. I've seen pictures of it and stuff like
He said he was asleep at his sister's house the night of the murders. Investigators asked to take photographs of his body. Police wanted to see if Dennis had any marks or scratches, signs of a physical altercation.
Tom's, yes. Thank you. Can you take off your shirt, please?
But no visible scratches or bruises were found on his body. Dennis also agreed to be fingerprinted. He was acting like a man with nothing to hide. Even though there was nothing glaring, Detective Romani wasn't convinced.
When I was told that LeBron Dennis responded to the Homicide Bureau to speak to me, I wasn't really surprised, but I was apprehensive. Maybe that he was coming forward to be too helpful. It became clear that he was trying to be very helpful.
Miami-Dade investigators went to Dennis's home. He continued to cooperate. They conducted a thorough search.
We're going to ask that you wait by the door here, okay? We're going to just look in your room. Okay.
Looking for anything that might be related to the crime. They found nothing out of the ordinary. Detectives asked Dennis for the clothes he had worn the previous night. The clothes would be examined for traces of blood or hair and fiber evidence, but nothing would be found. They also searched and photographed Dennis's car. But again found nothing suspicious. Despite the lack of evidence, police could not eliminate him as a suspect. Detectives had to expand their search if they were to solve the double murders, and they would need hard evidence to bring the killer to justice. Detectives were struggling to solve the brutal murders of University of Miami football player Marlon Barnes and his friend Tanganyika Lumpkins. Police considered Tanganyika's ex-boyfriend, LeBron Dennis, a potential suspect, but there was no evidence to link him to the crime. Investigators went to the area outside the nightclub where the victims were last seen. At a 24-hour gas station, a clerk had seen a suspicious man wearing a hooded sweatshirt, pacing back and forth, watching the club across the street. All of this took place at the same time Barnes and Tanganyika were inside the club partying. The clerk was concerned and called police. By the time they arrived, the man had gotten in a car and left. The clerk said she did not see his face. She gave a precise description of his car, recalling every detail, including the make and model, its tinted windows, and a missing rear license plate.
We have some pictures we'd like to show you.
Investigators showed the woman photos of LeBron Dennis's car. She didn't recognize it and was certain about what she had seen. police needed to locate the car and its driver. They looked further into the background of Timwanika, trying to find a lead to someone who may have wanted to harm her. They interviewed a number of her friends.
It wasn't a mutual thing at all. She wanted.
Detective Thomas Romani discovered that Timwanika's relationship with LeBrant Dennis had been fraught with violence and stalking, a far cry from the mutual breakup that Dennis had described.
It was a very controlling relationship.
And as we spoke to more friends and acquaintances, we learned that Timwanika and LeBrant Dennis had an argument early in the week, and she had left him. There had been some violent breakups and domestic violence between them.
Dennis said he was asleep at his sister's home when the murders occurred. Now, detectives weren't convinced. They obtained Dennis's cell phone records. On the morning before the murders, he'd made a call to a man named Stuart Dillard. Investigators were anxious to speak with him.
Hello, we're detectives with the Miami-Dade Police Department. We'd appreciate your cooperation.
They met with Stuart. He was extremely nervous. He, of course, saw the murder on the news, and he was able to put it together that he lent this sawed-off shotgun to LeBrant Dennis, and he suspected that the sawed-off shotgun was possibly used in some criminal act.
Stuart Dillard said that on April 14th, one day after the murders, Dennis called him again and told him where to retrieve his shotgun and duffel bag. Inside, Stuart found a large folding knife that was not his, and several articles of clothing. When he looked at his shotgun, Stuart noticed that the wooden fore-end was missing.
He became very afraid of what had happened. He put some things together in his mind, and he thought that he would be culpable or somehow involved.
Stuart told investigators he disposed of the clothing in a dumpster and had thrown the knife and shotgun down a storm drain. All he kept was the duffel bag. Investigators took possession of it, hoping they could tie it directly to LeBrant Dennis.
What about Mr. Little?
When we first started speaking to Stuart, we were apprehensive about what he was telling us because he did admit that he lent the potential murder weapon to LeBrant Dennis. So we did investigate thoroughly what he had to tell us, and we believe what he was telling us was the truth, that he unknowingly lent this firearm to LeBrant Dennis.
Dad, it's a knife.
Miami-Dade police went to the storm drain and found the discarded weapons, exactly where Stuart said they would be.
Some water. Anything else you see down there?
They retrieved the knife and the shotgun.
And that's what we're looking for.
I'm gonna go back down and see if there's anything else.
The weapons were bagged for analysis. Armed with this new evidence, the investigation of LeBrant Dennis intensified. Police interviewed his known acquaintances. Jamie Meyer was a former girlfriend.
Good, how you doing? Is this your car?
She admitted that she often loaned her car to Dennis.
Traffic violation. Do you mind if I take a few photos?
Police saw that her car resembled the suspicious vehicle seen on the night of the murders. An officer photographed the car. The vehicle had no rear license plate, like the vehicle described by the clerk at the gas station. Investigators re-interviewed the gas station clerk.
We showed the photographs of her car to the clerk, and she positively identified that as being the same car she saw on that evening.
Police had established another connection between LeBrant Dennis and the car. But it was highly circumstantial. To link him to the murders, they turned to the forensic evidence. They were confident that the bag had been used to carry the murder weapons. The duffel bag turned over by Dennis's friend Stewart was examined by criminalist Toby Wolson. Wolson found what appeared to be droplets of dried blood inside the bag.
I was asked to do the DNA interpretation of samples taken from a duffel bag, and we did analysis of those and compared those samples to the standards from the victim and the subject.
Wolson found a match between the blood in the duffel bag and the blood of one of the victims.
The DNA profiles obtained from the samples from the bag match the DNA profiles obtained from Marlon Barnes' bloodstain standard, which means that those samples came from Marlon Barnes.
Piece by piece, Miami authorities were building their case against LeBrant Dennis. Criminalists had evidence connecting Dennis's gym bag to one of the victims, but it would take more than a bloodstain to charge LeBrant Dennis with murder. The murders of University of Miami student Marlon Barnes and his childhood friend Tim Wanika Lumpkins were close to being solved. A wealth of evidence, including a knife and a shotgun, had been discovered. But so far, nothing tied the gruesome double murder directly to ex-boyfriend LeBrant Dennis. Miami-Dade criminalist Thomas Quirk examined the flat tire from the car Barnes had driven the night before he was killed.
I noted that the tire had a very curious V-shaped mark. Once I received the knife and examined the knife, I realized that the tip of the knife was bent and it was very dull. If this was a knife that made the marks, my job would be now to stab the tire with that knife and see if I could reproduce those V-shaped marks.
Quirk analyzed the test cuts against the punctures from the night of the crime. He found the two sets of punctures to be wholly consistent, concluding that Dennis's knife was used to slash the victim's tires. Quirk also examined the shotgun found in the storm drain. He compared wood splinters collected at the crime scene to the now bare forend of the shotgun.
It's no different than building an airplane or building a model car. You take the pieces, you look at them, you notice the fracture patterns to them, the manufacturer's markings, and you simply place them together and make a little mold out of it. And we found that once we did that, it fit perfectly into the frame of the shotgun. Chances are that this shotgun was used to bludgeon the two victims to death.
In addition to the wood splinters, they also collected metal fragments at the crime scene. Criminalist George Borghi examined the fragments.
At the time that the pieces of metal were found, they were unknown in terms of what the origin was. When the shotgun was recovered and they put all the pieces together, it was obvious from my perspective that it was a broken trigger guard, and the two pieces of metal looked like they could be fragments of metal from the trigger guard themselves.
But to prove an exact match between the metal fragments and the trigger guard would require more than the appearance of a close fit.
The molecular structure and the atomic structure of the metal particles are what give it the unique fracture pattern. Not only are the edges compared to show that the edges line up perfectly, in this situation it's a three-dimensional fracture. So besides the edges comparing favorably, the interior fractures compared favorably, meaning that every contoured edge of one piece fit within the contours of the adjoining piece and of the shotgun. So therefore, a combination of all those characteristics exclude the possibility that those trigger guard pieces came from any other weapon besides that one.
With this evidence, investigators now had probable cause. They charged LeBrant Dennis with the murders of Timwanika Lumpkins and Marlon Barnes. But to prove his guilt, police needed direct physical evidence. They once again turned to medical examiner Dr. Sam Galino. Galino had previously noted peculiar L and T-shaped wounds sustained by the victims. Galino compared the evidence to diagrams of the victims' injuries.
And we were able to compare different aspects of the shotgun to the wounds, and indeed found out that different aspects of the shotgun matched to a great degree of certainty the wounds that were on both of the bodies. I was able to conclude that this shotgun had been used to beat both Marlon Barnes and Timwanika Lumpkins.
LeBrant Dennis continued to profess his innocence, despite the strong case against him. But Miami-Dade investigators had amassed a wealth of evidence supporting his guilt, and it had all started with a case of envy.
From the evidence that we were able to establish in this investigation, LeBrant Dennis became extremely upset when he had found out that Timwanika Lumpkins went to meet Marlon Barnes at this event that hosted many celebrity football players from the NFL and college.
Investigators were convinced that LeBrant Dennis followed the victims to Marlon Barnes' apartment. When Barnes opened the door, Dennis struck him across the face. When Dennis finished attacking Barnes, he went after Timwanika. LeBrant Dennis was tried and convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. LeBrant Dennis's violent relationship with Timwanika Lumpkins led police to closely investigate him and ultimately solve the crime. But in some cases, there is no obvious suspect. Fresno, California is a quiet, peaceful city, known for its proximity to 3 national parks. On Friday, February 18, 2000, Nancy and Ralph Gower were making plans for the upcoming weekend.
Yeah, let's do lunch, sure.
Nancy was going to drive to their vacation home that evening.
So you're going to be real busy.
Ralph, who worked as an auto salesman, had to be at the dealership the following morning, but planned to drive up Saturday afternoon. The Gowers had been married for 12 years.
I'll be nice, Will.
I can't wait.
Thanks. Be nice.
That night, Nancy drove alone to their vacation house. The next morning, Ralph failed to show up for work. His concerned employer went to his house to check on him. But when she peered through the window, she saw him lying on the floor. Panicked, she tried to get Ralph's attention, but he wasn't moving. She called 911. Fresno police detectives Darrell Green and Al Murrieta responded. An emergency response team had already forced entry into the residence and pronounced the victim dead at the scene.
Take that side, I'll take this side. There it is.
2 bullet wounds marked the right side of his chest, but there were no shell casings present. The area immediately around the body seemed unusually clean, but detectives noted a small amount of blood under the sofa, perhaps overlooked by the killer.
Unless he was laying here originally.
Notice some of that dust here. Looks like something's been either moved or, well, there's some broken stuff underneath the table.
Something's not right, or the couch has been moved.
It appeared the furniture had been moved.
What initially stood out to the investigators is that we could tell that the couch had been moved and that the scene was extremely clean, indicating that someone had cleaned up the crime scene and moved furniture after the victim had been shot.
Crime scene investigators took photographs and meticulously dusted surfaces for fingerprints. Broken items on the coffee table suggested a struggle had taken place. In the entryway, investigators found a gym bag. Inside the bag was a loaded revolver.
Provide us with a serial number on your property sheet so we can check it. So we can get downtown. Maybe see if we can closer. Okay.
Detectives searched the house for signs of a break-in. There were none. The automatic garage door mechanism had been shut off.
It's disengaged from the lock there.
The door could now be opened by hand.
At the bottom, 12 printer.
Find anything over here?
No, I just checked that first drawer. I don't know what's in that bag. I haven't checked it.
Oh, goodness.
You want to turn these over to Mickey?
The detectives found more weapons in the garage. The assortment of firearms, along with the revolver found in the house, would be sent to a lab for ballistics tests.
Select this for now.
Detective Murrieta needed to contact the victim's wife.
I'm formulating questions in my mind. First of all, establishing where was she at the time that we believe the murder actually took place, who could alibi for her, and one other striking thing that I needed to clear up, who else had keys to that residence?
While the Fresno police pursued the investigation, Ralph Gower's body was autopsied. The pathologist would make further curious findings. Cause of death was attributed to the 2 bullet wounds to the chest. But pathologist Vinu Gopal noted something more.
At the autopsy, I found evidence of blunt trauma and gunshot wounds to the chest and injuries to the wrist. These injuries were consistent with handcuff injuries.
It appeared that Ralph Gower had been shackled to something before he was shot.
So we have handcuff injuries and somebody's laying on his back. Next thing you always think of, is it some sort of an execution style killing?
Police reached Nancy Gower and informed her of her husband's death.
Detective Maria from earlier.
She was shaken by the news and cooperated with the investigation.
A few things to just clarify on time. Can you tell me where you were Friday night?
The last time she saw her husband was the previous evening, just before she left for the vacation home.
You went back to work and I headed up to the cabin.
She expected Ralph to join her after he finished work, but he never showed up.
Oh, I don't know. I guess I was around.
Detective Green got a sense of Nancy and Ralph's marriage.
What we found was they were the all-American couple, and from talking to people who worked with both Nancy and Ralph, they were well-liked, and they seemed to be madly in love with each other.
Chance on that? Nancy, we're going to be needing to talk again, and we'll update you as we get the information. We're still in the early process of the investigation. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Everything that could potentially be a reason for the homicide was discredited, including any financial problems, any problems at work, anything that she thought could have been related, we were able to discredit.
The guns found at the crime scene were sent to the Fresno Crime Lab for testing. Criminalist Iqbal Sikhan tested bullets fired from the gun and compared them against the slugs retrieved from the victim. There were no matches, but characteristics of the slugs led Sikhan to the first clue of the killer's identity. He or she had used a .40 caliber firearm. But as the days passed, investigators had yet to develop a motive or suspect.
Remember the hand marks we had on here? Yeah. We were going to take them down and have them fingerprint.
They felt they had only one place to turn.
Get a hold of all the guys that are involved in this, and let's meet.
We felt our only option was to bring Nancy in and go deeper into their personal life, including giving her a polygraph to verify some of her earlier statements.
Nancy Gower had cooperated through the entire investigation of her husband's murder.
No motive for the murder. And we need to eliminate you as a suspect, and once we do that...
But to investigators, it seemed as if she had something to hide. In Fresno, California, police were investigating the murder of luxury auto salesman Ralph Gower. With no leads in the case, they asked Gower's wife, Nancy, to take a polygraph exam. She agreed, but just as the test was to begin, she wouldn't continue.
We've got a little bit of a problem. She doesn't want to take the test until she talks to both of you.
She asked to speak with the investigators.
Hi.
I understand you wanted to talk to us for a minute.
Yeah, I really think I should tell you something. Well, we
She made a stunning admission to Detective Green.
So we started having this.
The bombshell in this case was that Nancy indicated that she was having an affair with one of our police officers. Not only was he a police officer, but prior to coming onto the department, he had been a full-time minister and in fact was a chaplain with the Fresno Police Department, one of our own.
The officer's name was Paul Hirth. Nancy told the detectives that she and Hirth had been involved for several months, but she said she recently ended the affair. Hirth couldn't accept the breakup and continued calling her.
You know, he's also a Baptist minister, so I didn't want anybody
Investigators now faced the possibility of a killer in their ranks.
When Ralph was at work, sometimes we do that.
After Nancy's admission, she took the polygraph and passed.
You had a question about talking about...
An internal committee was formed to investigate.
We knew we had to hurry on this case. If a police officer was the suspect and we were allowing an officer to continue to work and he was a murder suspect, speed was of the utmost.
Police checked the staff sign-in sheet for the night of Ralph's murder.
Is there any indication they were supposed to work that night?
No, should have been his regular day off.
According to the sheet, Officer Hirth and his partner were on duty during the time in question.
Later what's going on in this. Thanks.
When investigators spoke with Hirth's partner, he said that he had not worked that night and had not initialed the sign-out sheet.
Do you work with Paul Hirth?
Yes, I do. Okay.
It appeared Officer Hirth was attempting a cover-up. Police called him in for questioning.
Hi, Paul. Sergeant Green with Homicide. This is Detective Marietta. I want to talk to you about the death of Ralph Gower. Occurred about a week ago.
Actually, I was expecting a call from him.
Really?
But, hey, look, I didn't do
Hirth was forthcoming about the affair, but denied committing any crime.
I may have broke some police rules, but again, I didn't murder anybody.
Okay, well, that's kind of what we thought. We were wondering if maybe you couldn't fill us in a little bit. Were you working February 18th?
Yes.
Oh, you were?
Yes. Yeah, I was on patrol at a college campus.
He stated that he had been on patrol on the 18th.
And I broke up the fight.
You were,
They asked
you
about
were
his
with,
partner.
A partner that night?
It was Officer Andre Benson.
So he was working?
No, I signed him in, but he wasn't there.
Oh, he didn't show up? Or?
I signed him in, but he didn't show up.
Okay. Could we look in your locker?
When they asked Hurth if they could search his house and his work locker, he agreed.
Take a look at your gun?
That'd be okay.
Okay, good. Let's go down to, let's go out this way and take a look at, okay, could you step right back over? Okay.
They took his police-issued equipment along with his uniform. Inside the officer's home, investigators located his service weapon. It was a .40 caliber Beretta, the same caliber gun used in the killing of Ralph Gower. Criminalists Iqbal Sikhan and Gary Kortner received Hurth's weapon. The gun was fired into a sealed water tank. Fired slugs from Hurth's pistol would be compared to the slugs that killed Ralph Gower. Police waited anxiously for results to see if the gun used to uphold the law would be the same weapon used to break it. Fresno police were investigating fellow officer Paul Hurth. They believed he had murdered the husband of his former lover, Nancy Gower. Criminalist Iqbal Sikhan performed a side-by-side comparison of slugs fired from Officer Hurth's handgun and the bullets that killed Ralph Gower. Sikhan looked at several class characteristics, including the caliber, the direction of the twist, and the lands and grooves of the slugs. The results pointed directly at the suspect.
The bullets that killed the victim came out of Paul Hurth's duty pistol.
Paul Hurth was arrested for the murder of Ralph Gower. When he was confronted with the evidence, he quickly changed his story.
Paul, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can't.
Officer Hurth now claimed he went to the Gower house with the sole intention of apologizing for his indiscretions with Ralph's wife.
I know you have relations with your wife. With my wife? Yeah, how's the matter with you?
When Hurth told him about the affair, he became enraged and attacked the officer. He said during the struggle, Ralph got control of his baton. He said he went into police mode and drew his gun. After shooting Ralph twice, he panicked and proceeded to clean up the room. Finally, he let himself out through the garage and returned to work. Hurth's claim of shooting Ralph Gower in self-defense rang hollow with investigators.
Slightly higher as it exits. Yes.
To test the officer's story, they re-examined the crime scene reports.
Spots about the size of a $50, 50-cent piece. About a dime. Yeah, 10 cents. Yeah.
They believed the angle of the bullet wounds to Gower's chest proved he'd been shot from above at a distance of 2 feet while lying defenseless on the floor. Investigators returned to the Gower house.
6'3". Get over here. It was on the ground at that time. Right. Okay. Yes.
And let's see if there is any other
chance of-
evidence of any damage.
They
to the
scoured the
walls.
crime scene for any indication of bullet damage to the walls. If the victim had been standing, as Hirth claimed, the bullets would have passed through his body and there would be damage to the walls. But there was none.
Possible scenario is that the victim was
All the crime scene evidence supported the case that Officer Hirth was standing over the victim when he fired.
or you could be here.
Despite convincing evidence, prosecutors know juries are often reluctant to convict officers of the law. Fresno authorities turned to the FBI. Police enlisted the help of forensic profiler and criminalist Mark Safaric. As a special agent with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, Safaric studies crime scene photos and other evidence from individual cases. From the case materials, he developed a profile of the dynamics that took place between the victim and the assailant. His conclusions in the Gower case contradicted Paul Hirth's claims of self-defense.
I think both behaviorally and forensically, it's clear that Gower was not in a position to present a threat to Hirth. There's no indication his hands were in front of his face or attempting to ward off the potential of being shot. And the fact that the gunshot wounds are so close together, almost directly over the heart area, tells me that he was likely unconscious at the time he was shot.
Based on the evidence, police believe that Paul Hirth went to Ralph Gower's house with no other intention but to kill him. Nancy Gower had ended the affair, and he needed to dispose of his rival. Investigators believe Hirth struck Gower with his baton, then proceeded to handcuff him to a table leg before shooting him twice in the chest. Investigators concluded that Paul Hirth acted alone, and Nancy had no knowledge of his intentions. Paul Hirth was convicted of aggravated manslaughter for the death of Ralph Gower. He was sentenced to 20 years. Killers commit their crimes for many reasons. But when they are driven by dark emotion, they unwittingly leave behind a history of clues. Forensic science exploits these clues to uncover hard evidence and solve crimes of passion. A deadly house fire in Boise, Idaho claims the lives of a father and his two young stepchildren. As investigators sift through the ashes for answers, they uncover evidence that the blaze was no accident. In Northern California, a man is reported missing, and all indications suggest a tragic accident is to blame. But a routine investigation soon exposes a web of deception, fraud, and possibly murder. When money is at stake, some predators will stop at nothing to exploit another's trust. But even the most complex schemes can't survive the scrutiny of those determined to find justice for victims who have been fatally betrayed. Nestled in the western foothills of the Rocky Mountains, Ada County, Idaho is home to the state capital of Boise. It is also home to some 400,000 residents who work, live, and play here.
This is the fire department.
In the pre-dawn hours of February 10, 1992, emergency dispatchers received a 911 call. A man reported that his house, a two-story duplex, was on fire. And he believed a family of 4 who shared the house was still trapped inside. Within minutes, firefighters and emergency units from the surrounding area responded to the call. Fire and smoke consumed the duplex. Firefighters struggled to bring the first-floor blaze under control. Rescue workers fought their way through the flames and thick smoke to see if anyone had been trapped inside. In a second-floor bedroom, they discovered a man lying motionless on the bed. A young girl was found on the floor a few feet away. As the search continued, firefighters recovered the body of a young boy in a nearby bedroom. All of the victims were rushed outside for treatment. But despite the rescue workers' efforts, all 3 were pronounced dead at the scene. The man who lived in the separate residence inside the duplex told police that around 4 a.m. he was awakened by his smoke alarm. He tried to wake up the other family, but got no response. He identified the victims as 34-year-old Randy Rowe and his 2 stepchildren. He didn't know the whereabouts of the children's mother, Robin Rowe, who also lived at the residence. Then, 2 women arrived at the scene. One identified herself as Robin Rowe. Visibly shaken by the news, emergency workers escorted the young mother away from the house. Her friend, Joan McHugh, told police that Robin had fallen asleep at her house earlier that evening. Robin had awakened her just a short while earlier and wanted to return home. She had a premonition that something bad had happened to her family. All of the victims' bodies were removed from the scene and transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Now, Fire Marshal Doug McGrew began looking for clues to tell him how and why the fire started.
We started looking into the ignition source of the fire by doing, like we do on all fires, we do an exterior walk around to the building, we look and see where the least damage is, we go there, and we start working towards the areas where the most damage occurred. Once we get into that area, then we start digging down through and layering through the debris and trying to determine exactly what ignited the fire.
Almost immediately, investigators made a strange discovery. The circuit breaker that controlled power to the family's smoke alarm was in the off position. But that did little to explain how the fire started. And because the damage was so extensive, finding those answers would take time. Within hours, autopsies were performed on Randy Rowe and the 2 children. The medical examiner found lethal amounts of soot and carbon monoxide in each of the victims' lungs and mucous membranes. He concluded that all three had died as a result of smoke inhalation caused by the fire. As the search for the fire's cause continued into the morning hours, arson investigators sifting through the ashes made a troubling find. On the carpet and in a charred pile of laundry, they discovered burn patterns suggesting a flammable liquid had been poured over the area. And the spot was just inches away from vents that circulate air throughout the residence. Investigators collected several pieces of the charred remains for further analysis. All indications were pointing to arson. And that suggested that the fire that had claimed the lives of the two young children and their stepfather had been intentionally set. To find out, State Fire Marshal Don Dillard delivered the charred samples collected from the house to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab, located in Pocatello. By comparing a burned sample believed to contain an accelerant to one that was untouched by the fire, he hoped criminologists could find answers.
What I've asked our criminologists to do is to compare the two, what we feel the one to be evidence, and then the one that we feel probably doesn't have any kind of an accelerant on it, and she compares those two, and by doing that, hopefully comes to the conclusion that there either is or isn't an accelerant involved in the case.
Forensic examiner Susan Williamson began testing the samples for the presence of an ignitable liquid. First, Williamson inserts a strip of charcoal ribbon in the sealed cans that contain the charred samples. Then, the can is placed in a chamber and heated for several hours. If any flammable substance is present, the heat will turn it into vapor, which will then be absorbed by the charcoal strip. Once the evidence has been heated, the charcoal strip is removed from the can. To transform any trapped vapors back into a liquid, solvents are then added to the strip. The resulting liquid is then subjected to sophisticated detection equipment that measures for the presence of known flammable substances. When the process was completed, Williamson analyzed the results.
One of the samples contained an ignitable liquid. And in this case, I identified a heavy petroleum distillate. And heavy petroleum distillates include things like kerosene, number 2 and number 1 diesel fuel, and fuel, heating fuel oil, and so forth.
The analysis had exposed the deadly fire as an act of arson. And more disturbing, it had exposed a triple homicide. Forensic examiners had exposed a house fire in Ada County, Idaho, that had claimed 3 lives as a triple murder. The findings were passed on to homicide investigators. Looking for answers, detectives turned to Robin Rowe, the wife and mother of the 3 victims. When asked why she wasn't at the residence on the night of the fire, Robin explained she had been staying at her friend's house. Over the past few months, her marriage had been falling apart.
Well, that was the strange thing.
In fact, Robin believed that her husband Randy might have intentionally set the deadly fire. She said that recently, Randy had become increasingly abusive toward her. The smallest things would set him off, and he couldn't seem to control his anger, even in front of the children. Robin claimed that on one occasion, Randy had struck her so hard she was forced to go to the hospital. Several hours before the fire, Randy had called her at her friend's house and demanded that she come home. When she refused, he threatened that she would never see him or her children again. Though it appeared Randy Rowe had made good on his threats, the story troubled veteran detective Gary Rainey.
Any parent is protective over their children, and had he been this abusive parent, any reasonable spouse would have wanted to remove the kids from that situation. Her story was that he was only abusive with her and not with the kids. That's not the norm, and certainly in law enforcement we recognize that that abusive personality, that violent personality, the anger control problems is not going to just be focused on one particular person, especially with those pre-teen age kids who sometimes anger parents pretty easily.
With their suspicions raised, police wanted to learn more about the Rose marriage and corroborate Robin's alibi. They began with Joan McHugh, the woman who had been with Robin at the time of the fire.
Well, there was some abuse problems.
Because of Randy's abuse, Robin, she said, had been staying with her. That night, Robin had fallen asleep on her couch around 11 p.m.
And then,
Joan went to bed a short while later and never heard anything to suggest Robin ever left the apartment. Joan had no doubt that Robin was a victim of domestic violence.
and she said that it had been going on for quite a while, but she had never said anything to anyone. And it just seemed to escalate over a period of, I don't know, about 4 or 5 weeks. And a few times she came here, 10 or 11 o'clock with the children, because they were escaping from Randy.
The information gave Robin Rowe a solid alibi for the time of the 3 deaths. And the result of the forensic analysis had made it plausible that Randy Rowe had in fact killed himself and his 2 stepchildren in a vengeful act of rage. But that theory would not go unchallenged.
I learned that there had been some domestic violence going on. But then as a couple other people called, and I learned that there wasn't domestic violence going on according to them. And so it just started not adding up very well.
To learn more, police brought in Randy Rowe's sister to answer questions.
Any signs that Robin or the kids were the victims of any kind of violence, any bruises by anybody?
She didn't believe that Robin was the victim of domestic violence, as she had portrayed herself to be.
Ever any discussion?
Though Randy and Robin had begun to fight more and more, he was not a violent person. The kids were Randy's life. His sister knew that he never would have harmed them. And according to the sister, Robin treated Randy as little more than her kid's babysitter. As a result, Randy talked openly about the possibility of divorce. But he loved the children as if they were his own. And the kids made it clear that they didn't want Randy to go.
The children had, at one time, reportedly told Robin that they wanted to stay with Randy and not go with her. And of course, they were Robin's natural children and not Randy's.
To resolve all of the conflicting information about the couple, investigators decided to take a closer look into Robin Rowe's background. What they found was shocking. According to records, Robin had tragically lost a son nearly 15 years earlier. Her 6-year-old boy had died in a suspicious fire at her California home. Arson investigators were never able to determine a cause of the fire. But for Idaho police, the similarities between the tragedies had to be more than coincidental. Robin Rowe was now emerging as the prime suspect in the deaths of her husband and 2 children. But with an airtight alibi and no obvious motive to explain such an unthinkable crime, police knew that proving it would not be easy. Police in Ada County, Idaho, struggled to find answers in a deadly house fire that had claimed 3 lives. Robin Rowe, the wife and mother of the victims, had an airtight alibi for the night of the murders. But all of the evidence was pointing to her as the prime suspect. What investigators needed was proof. Looking for potential clues, they began reviewing statements made by Robin's friends and family.
Husband's kids.
They found that one friend had stated that a few days prior to the fire, Robin had mentioned that she had rented a storage unit and had taken some of her belongings there. The timing of the rental was too close to the murders for police to ignore. Detective Gary Rainey followed up on the lead. Soon, he was able to locate the unit that Robin had rented. With a warrant in hand, investigators were dispatched to the storage unit. There, they found boxes of personal papers belonging to Robin. Among the items was an envelope filled with several $100s in cash and bingo receipts from the YWCA where Robin Rowe worked. Police also collected several life insurance policies taken out on Robin Rowe's husband and her 2 children. Robin was listed as the sole beneficiary on all of the policies, and she stood to gain more than $275,000 from the 3 deaths. It was powerful circumstantial evidence of murder.
One of the most disturbing facts being that she took out the last 2 policies. She already had multiple policies, but Robin took out the last 2 policies on the children January 24th, and the fire was February 10th.
Still, it wasn't enough to take Robin Rowe into custody. Police began interviewing Robin's co-workers at the YWCA. The manager was surprised to learn that cash and receipts had been found in the storage facility. Robin had reported that proceeds from the Y's last bingo game had been destroyed in the house fire that killed her family. Though authorities lacked hard physical evidence of murder, they now had proof of embezzlement. The prime suspect in the triple homicide investigation was placed under arrest and charged with grand theft. But police were a long way from proving that Robin Rowe was a cold-blooded killer. Hoping to generate a lead that could destroy her alibi, details of the crime were released through the media. A short while later, police got a tip. A local newspaper delivery man called and told police that he remembered something unusual on the night of the fire. He said that while making deliveries around 4 a.m. that morning, he saw a car driving away from the duplex. He wasn't sure of the make of the car, but he described it as a late model 4-door with rectangular taillights. Detective Ken Smith asked the delivery man to come down to the station.
We had, prior to his arrival at the sheriff's office, had arranged to have vehicles similar to Robin Rowe's vehicle in the back lot, and Robin Rowe's vehicle was in the back lot. We walked him into the lot and asked him to look for vehicles that, or look and see if there were any vehicles that matched the description of the vehicle that he had seen in the subdivision on the morning of the fire. When he observed Robin Rowe's vehicle, he immediately pointed to that vehicle and stated that it was the same body style, same color, and resembled the car that he had seen.
You sure?
Definitely.
The witness had placed a car similar to Robin Rowe's near the crime scene just a short while before fire consumed the duplex. Detectives still had to overcome a major obstacle. Robin's friend, Joan McHugh, had provided her with a solid alibi for the time of the homicides. Though police didn't think Joan was lying, they theorized that Robin had managed to slip out of the apartment undetected. Detective Gary Rainey was determined to find out.
I devised a scenario to try to prove or disprove Robin's presence in the apartment, and that was to have Joan confront Robin with the idea that she got up in the middle of the night, 3:30 in the morning, which was the time that we knew about when the fire started, that Joan would tell Robin that she came downstairs to get a drink of water and Robin wasn't there.
When contacted, Joan McHugh agreed that the next time Robin called her from prison, she would tell her the false story and record the conversation. Joan was only too happy to cooperate.
I'm sure, I really shouldn't speak for Detective Rainey, but I'm sure that he believed that somewhere in the phone calls she would absolutely destroy all of her alibis. And I just knew that she was going to explain everything and he was going to feel like a fool because she was innocent. There is no way a mother kills her children. And so I agreed to tape the phone calls.
On the evening of February 20th, Robin called Joan from prison.
There's something that I have to talk to you about. That morning, I came downstairs, and you weren't here, Robin. Where were you?
Yeah, I know. I went outside.
It wasn't the answer she expected. Robin repeated her story that at around 3:30 a.m., she was awakened by a strange premonition that something bad had happened to her family. But now, she added that she then contacted a psychiatrist and left the apartment to speak with her for over an hour. On tape, Robin had destroyed her alibi. Joan McHugh was devastated.
It was terrible. And I didn't know what to do after. It was on a tape recording. And it was like, you know, do I call Gary or do I just take this thing and throw it in the trash and no one will ever know? But I would have known. And it probably sounds dramatic, but Randy and the children deserve better than that. So I called Gary.
Police finally had enough evidence to charge Robin Rowe with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Based on the evidence, detectives believe that in the early morning hours of February 10th, Robin Rowe slipped out of her friend's house and returned to her own home. She turned off power to the smoke alarm. Then, driven by a twisted desire to cash in on her family's life insurance policies, she placed a pile of laundry near the air vents and set the deadly blaze. After murdering her husband and 2 children, Robin calmly returned to Joan McHugh's house to establish her alibi.
Psychological experts have described to me that it's simply a balance in her mind of what she personally is better off with, a husband and 2 children, or the proceeds of life insurance policies and the opportunity to move to a new state, and that she simply weighed those 2 things and decided that the money and the new life was what she wanted today.
Robin Rowe was convicted of arson and 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of her husband, Randy, and her 2 children. She was sentenced to death. Idaho police had to reconcile conflicting information to find the truth. In California, detectives must follow a complex maze in order to expose a murder. Known for its temperate climate and lush farmland, Yolo County, California offers a quiet, rural lifestyle, miles outside the state capital of Sacramento. But residents there are no strangers to tragedy. On the morning of February 5th, 1997, 911 dispatchers at the Yolo County Sheriff's Department received a call from a concerned mother.
Do you have a responsible on that?
She feared that her son was missing. Deputies responded to the home. Patty Howard told the officer that she hadn't seen or heard from her 18-year-old son, Nick, since the previous evening. Patty said that the night before, Nick had helped her close up the auto body shop that the Howard family owned. As they were leaving, Nick said he had to retrieve a wallet he had left behind at a nearby restaurant. He told his mother he would be home in a couple of hours and said goodbye. But around midnight, Nick called and left a message on the answering machine. He said he was having car problems and was running late. But he never made it home that night. The family was very close, and it was completely out of character for Nick not to call and check in. Missing teenagers often turn up within a few days. But for Yolo County Detective Larry Cecchetini, Nick Howard didn't seem to fit the profile of a typical runaway.
This is probably one of the closest knit families that I've ever seen. They just, from all indications, they were a very close, very loving family. For Nick to call and not come home was just something that had never happened before.
Investigators feared the teenager's car troubles had led to an accident. Police, friends, and family retraced his usual route. But after 2 days, the search had turned up nothing. Then, 2 men out on the search flagged down a patrol car near the banks of the Sacramento River. They had discovered tire tracks that led from the shoulder of the road down toward the riverbank.
Right down up here? Right over here. Why do you think these are Nick's?
I figured nobody else would be laying those tracks down there. I don't know.
One of the men, 42-year-old Ralph Marcus, said he was a close friend of the Howard family.
Charles 22, I think we have a 972 that went over the cliff. If you could start dark.
10-4.
Ralph said that he and his associate, Jake Stanton, were out looking for Nick when they came upon the tracks. Unsure if the discovery was related to Nick's disappearance, Detective Cecchetini was contacted. He knew that stretch of highway well, and the news was not encouraging.
That's what I was thinking. This strip of roadway is a winding strip of river road. There are no guardrails on our county side. Quite frequently, inattentive or sleepy drivers do go into the river.
Search and rescue units from the Yolo County Sheriff's Department and officers from the California Highway Patrol responded to the scene. The team followed the tracks down an embankment. They led to the water's edge and then disappeared into the river. Members of the Yolo County Boat Patrol and rescue divers began scouring the river. After several hours of searching, divers signaled they had found something. 16 feet below the surface, they had discovered a vehicle resting on the riverbed. A tow truck pulled the car from the muddy river. The vehicle matched the description of the one driven by Nick Howard. A wallet recovered from the passenger seat contained the driver's license of the missing teenager. Examiners began searching the vehicle for clues. On the floorboard, they found Nick's prescription eyeglasses. They were bent, as if his head had violently impacted the dashboard or the steering wheel. Then, police noticed that a film of oil coated the vehicle's interior. It appeared to have come from an opened container of motor oil located in the back seat. The vehicle was towed to a police impound lot for a more thorough examination. Officers and divers from the boat patrol continued searching the area for any signs of Nick Howard. But there was no trace of the teenager. And if he was unconscious and not wearing his seatbelt when he went into the river, the powerful currents had likely carried his body miles away. With so many unanswered questions, police looked for clues to explain the accident. But aside from the tire tracks at the side of the road, little else was found.
Usually if the vehicle went into the water at a high rate of speed, you're going to have a lot of broken rocks, you're going to have debris, possibly some skid marks, some significant physical evidence.
As the investigation continued, detectives received some unexpected information. Nick Howard's family had handed over some papers they found while going through his room. One was a life insurance policy in the teenager's name that was worth $850,000. There was also an uncompleted change of beneficiary form that listed Ralph Marcus, the man who had discovered the tire tracks at the river, as the new beneficiary. Police were surprised that someone as young as Nick Howard would have such a large insurance policy.
Essentially, he was spending a quarter of his monthly income on a life insurance policy, which struck us as odd. It's not something that, life insurance just isn't something that an 18-year-old thinks about, especially when it costs that amount of money. Why don't you have a seat right there?
And that wasn't the only troubling news. An acquaintance of Nick Howard's came forward with information.
Tell me about Nick's life insurance.
He believed that Nick was alive and well. Recently, he said, the teenager had boasted that his life insurance policy would make him a millionaire.
He had this big policy.
All he had to do was fake his own death, disappear, and then have Ralph Marcus collect on the policy. A polygraph test later confirmed he was telling the truth. The frantic search for a missing teenager had taken an unexpected turn. Now, investigators had to consider that Nick Howard had staged the auto accident and his own disappearance. To find out, police enlisted the aid of the California Highway Patrol's Accident Reconstruction Unit. Using the tire tracks found by the side of the road as his guide, investigator Steve Walker surveyed the scene. Detailed measurements indicated that the car had left the road at a 45-degree angle, and there was no evidence of vaulting or bouncing onto the shoulder. That suggested the car was traveling no faster than 14 miles per hour when it left the road. It was unlikely that a sleeping or inattentive driver had caused the vehicle to end up in the river. And there was no evidence suggesting that a collision had taken place.
There was no debris, there were no fluids, stains on the roadway. There was nothing that you typically see in a traffic collision. It was very, very anomalous. And it likewise fit the idea that the car had not departed from the roadway in a violent manner, that it was set up to leave the roadway in a more controlled manner.
Police next examined the engine of Nick Howard's car, looking for any mechanical problems that could explain the accident. Almost immediately, they found a clue. A plastic bottle cap had been intentionally wedged into the engine's throttle, holding it open. And the cap had originated from the opened container of motor oil recovered from the vehicle's interior. With their suspicions raised, police turned to auto expert Charles Radford of the California Highway Patrol. To determine the significance of the findings, he conducted an experiment. He wedged the cap into the throttle of a car with a similar manual transmission engine. He put the car in gear and then turned on the ignition. The engine revved up to 6,000 RPMs and then lurched forward.
And we could get speeds in second of as high as 20 miles an hour, and in fourth gear it was approximately 15 miles an hour within a 100 to 150 foot range. What this shows is that it would be very easy for someone to be able to take a car and put it in the river by use of an oil bottle cap.
All of the evidence police had gathered now led them to believe that 18-year-old Nick Howard had in fact staged his own disappearance. And now he was wanted for questioning in the elaborate insurance fraud scheme. But so far, all efforts to locate the teenager had turned up nothing. Police in Yolo County, California continued their search for 18-year-old Nick Howard. While looking for answers, they uncovered evidence suggesting the teenager and his friend, Ralph Marcus, had staged the disappearance. It appeared to be an elaborate scam to collect on a life insurance policy worth $850,000. But with Nick Howard's whereabouts uncertain, police turned their focus to Ralph Marcus, the beneficiary of the insurance policy. A background check on the 42-year-old heightened Detective Larry Ceccattini's suspicions that the disappearance was in fact a hoax and that Ralph Marcus was somehow involved.
Ralph Marcus had done thefts, identity scams, insurance fraud, bankruptcy fraud. He was a drug runner.
Under questioning, Ralph Marcus denied any involvement in Nick's disappearance. And he knew nothing about any insurance scams.
Tell me about your relationship with Nick.
Ralph said he had been a friend of the Howard family for years. Nick was like a godson to him. He was shocked to learn that he was the beneficiary of Nick's life insurance policy. Ralph said he wasn't interested in the money. Police sensed he was lying. But with no hard evidence, they had no choice but to release him. The investigation was going nowhere. Then, on February 25th, 1997, 3 weeks after Nick Howard disappeared, Yolo County Police got a break. But it wasn't one they had expected. A man fishing on the Sacramento River had called police after discovering human remains. Less than a mile from where Nick Howard's car was found, police recovered the partially decomposed remains of a young man. The victim, found with a single glove on his right hand, matched the description of the missing teenager. And dental records later confirmed that Nick Howard had finally been found. With no obvious cause of death, the body was transported to the Yolo County Coroner's Office. There, forensic pathologist Dr. Brian Peterson began looking for answers.
Here's some pictures of the body, how we found them on scene.
A close examination of the glove and the clothing indicated that no traces of motor oil were present. And that suggested the victim was not in his car when it went into the water. For Detective Ceccattini, the findings didn't make sense.
A couple of things just didn't add up. For one, the body was wearing one glove, which we thought was somewhat unusual. I remembered that the car was coated with motor oil. when we initially located it, but yet there were no traces of motor oil on the clothing. Granted, he'd been in the water for some time, but the traces of motor oil are not going to be entirely washed from the body.
Dr. Peterson next looked to establish a cause of death. Fluid found in the victim's lung suggested Nick Howard had drowned. But there was also something else.
Additionally, there were changes consistent with manual strangulation, bleeding inside the muscles of the neck.
Nick Howard had been murdered. For the Howard family and for investigators, the discovery was devastating. In addition to the tragic loss, it was now clear that Nick Howard had not staged his own disappearance. And Ralph Marcus was now the prime suspect in his death.
Now we have a body. We've pretty much determined that the body was not in the car when it went in. We have an $850,000 potential life insurance payout, and we have the beneficiary, and we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we get to the bottom line on this and get to the truth of what happened.
Police contacted the insurance agent in nearby Sacramento who handled Nick's policy. According to records, Nick came in a few weeks before he disappeared requesting that Ralph Marcus be named the new beneficiary. But he didn't have all of the correct paperwork, and the change was not completed. But Nick didn't seem to understand, and the agent believed that he left that day convinced that his policy had in fact been updated.
In the insurance agent's opinion, when Nick left, he was under the impression that the change was completed and that Ralph Marcus was the beneficiary.
Though incriminating, the information fell short of the smoking gun investigators would need to prove murder. Then they got a break. A witness asked Detective Cecchetini to meet him at a pier on the Sacramento River. Jake Stanton, the man who was with Ralph Marcus when the tire tracks were discovered at the river, believed he had important information about the case. Jake said that shortly after Nick went missing, Ralph had asked for his help in searching for the teenager. While driving along the Sacramento River, Ralph pulled up to the pier. He said it was one of Nick's favorite spots. As they searched the area, Jake saw Ralph Marcus walk to the end of the pier toward a black glove.
As Jake turns around, he sees Ralph ditch the glove off the top of the pier. Before Jake even says anything, Ralph mentions to him, "I was trying to get the glove."
Detectives showed Jake the black glove recovered from Nick Howard's body.
You ever see anything that looks like this?
He was certain it was identical to the one Marcus had kicked off the pier.
Jake was adamant about the fact that Ralph was trying to kick the glove off so that it could not be recovered. The significance of this is that we had never told anybody that when Nick was found, he was wearing one glove.
The information brought police one step closer to proving that Ralph Marcus had murdered 18-year-old Nick Howard. But so far, all of the evidence was circumstantial. Police in Yolo County, California were now certain that 18-year-old Nick Howard had been murdered for his life insurance policy, worth $850,000. All of the evidence suggested that Ralph Marcus, the beneficiary of the policy, was responsible. The suspect was brought in for another interview. Police showed him the black glove that had been recovered from the victim. Though witnesses saw Marcus kick an identical glove into the Sacramento River, he claimed he hadn't seen one like it before. Marcus continued to insist that he had no knowledge of Nick's life insurance policy and was in no way involved in his death. He pointed to the fact that he had gone to great lengths to help find Nick after he disappeared. But detectives believe that Ralph Marcus had only done that in order to divert attention from himself.
Thank you very much.
Authorities obtained a warrant to search the home Ralph Marcus shared with his mother. There, they found several documents relating to Nicholas Howard's insurance policy. And Marcus was in the process of filing a claim for the $850,000. The suspect was well aware of Nick's life insurance policy, something he had repeatedly denied. He was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Police believe that Ralph Marcus was able to get 18-year-old Nick Howard to agree to stage his own death after making him the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. But Marcus never intended to split up the money. Once the plan was in place, he beat and strangled the teenager, then tossed him into the river to die. After placing the teenager's wallet and glasses inside the vehicle, Marcus rigged the engine of Nick's car with an oil cap and sent the vehicle into the water, hoping his death would appear as an accident. Ralph Marcus was convicted of the first-degree murder of Nicholas Howard and sentenced to life in prison. Greed and self-interest can be strong motivations for murder. And when the killer is cunning, the truth can be elusive. But detectives and forensic scientists are dedicated to finding justice for unsuspecting victims who have found themselves betrayed. Canadian police are on the hunt for a missing woman. Though all indications suggest murder, they must rely on a single strand of animal hair to prove it. When an Ohio woman vanishes, suspicions swirl around her husband. What police lack is hard evidence. In Missouri, a man is found brutally murdered.
Doesn't look like it.
To catch his killer, police must piece together his final minutes. Sometimes, the murder suspect is immediately apparent, but the proof remains elusive. When there are no witnesses to speak for a victim, forensic scientists must transform the smallest clue into a material witness. Tucked away in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the southeast corner of Canada lies the remote and sparsely populated Prince Edward Island. On October 7th, 1994, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, responded to a complaint about an abandoned vehicle found on private property. When the constable arrived, he discovered the car resting a few hundred yards off a private road. No tags were present.
41 to base.
A check on the vehicle identification number revealed it was registered to a woman named Shirley Duguay.
Number IG4, AB69.
Police arranged to have the vehicle impounded and then began trying to track down the owner. But when the woman failed to return their calls, detectives decided to go to her address. There, they were met by Shirley Duguay's father and her children's babysitter. The news of the abandoned car concerned them. Shirley, they said, had not been heard from in some time. The babysitter said that she last saw the 32-year-old mother of 5 4 days earlier. Shirley was leaving to run some errands. She never mentioned where she was going. She said goodbye and promised to be back in a few hours. For RCMP Inspector Alphonse McNeil, the story had raised a troubling question.
We wondered why they didn't report her missing. They said that they were concerned that an ex-common law spouse by the name of Douglas Beamish, who she had had the three young children with, would end up getting the children if social services found out that she was missing or gone. So they tried to hold back that information as long as they could, hoping that they would find her.
For investigators, the time for waiting was over. Fearing that harm may have come to Shirley Duguay, police processed her abandoned vehicle for clues. What they found was not encouraging. Dozens of tiny reddish-brown stains tested positive for human blood. And barely visible blood-stain patterns found on the windshield and larger ones on the seats were consistent with having been caused by someone being punched or bludgeoned.
There was blood in the vehicle. Shirley Duguay had been missing for 4 days, so we were concerned that Shirley Duguay had met some form of demise in that vehicle.
Investigators returned to the area where the abandoned car had been found. For hours, the search for clues to the young woman's fate turned up nothing. Then, 500 meters from where the car was discovered, investigators found something. It was a pillow stained with what appeared to be blood. And a short distance away lay a blood-stained t-shirt. A shovel was also found nearby. All of the findings pointed to murder. And the shovel led police to believe that Shirley had likely been buried somewhere close by. But a thorough search failed to produce the victim's body. Now, police wanted to speak with the man who had the most to gain from her disappearance. Her ex-common law husband and the father of 3 of her children. Doug Beamish admitted that he and Shirley's relationship had been troubled in the past. And he realized that her family probably blamed him for her disappearance. But he insisted he knew nothing about it. For the sake of the children, he and Shirley had managed to work out their problems. He said he last saw her a week or so earlier. He had been having car problems, and Shirley offered to give him a ride to a job site where he was employed as a construction worker. On the way there, they had a pleasant conversation about their kids and planned to speak more later. She then dropped him off at the site, and the two said goodbye. He hadn't heard from her since. Doug Beamish sensed that something was bothering Shirley. He speculated that she had left town to visit some friends in Toronto. But it turned out that no one there had heard from her in some time.
RCMP Inspector McNeil speaking.
Then, police got a call.
North End 1?
A woman who had been following the case in the media believed she had important information.
This lady called and she said, I remember back around the time that Shirley Duguay went missing, I saw a car similar to hers on a road called the Allen Road. which would be about 20 kilometers away from where we found the car. I remember it was in the evening, it was dark. I saw two people on the side of the road, a tall man, a very small woman. They appeared to be arguing, and I just drove by, and I don't know if it's any good to you or not.
The woman couldn't be certain she had in fact seen Shirley Duguay. Still, the information was enough for police to search the area where the caller had seen the couple. But to cover the several square miles, they knew they needed help. Personnel from the Canadian Army agreed to participate in the search. For several days, their efforts turned up nothing. But then, they found something that seemed out of place.
One group came across a white plastic bag. We had a police officer with every group of searchers from the military. The police officer seized the bag.
The search of the area failed to produce any additional evidence. At the crime lab, examiners carefully removed the contents of the plastic bag. They recovered an old pair of white tennis shoes. There was also a large man's jacket stuffed inside. Several fibers and a single white hair were recovered. But further scrutiny revealed the presence of tiny stains that tested positive for human blood. Based on the information provided by the witness, police believed it had originated from Shirley Duguay. Now they needed to prove it. But there was a problem.
We didn't have Shirley Duguay, so we needed to be able to develop a DNA profile. The way we did that's what's called, in some cases, reverse paternity. We took a sample from her father, her brother, and her two sons.
Though everyone's DNA is unique, a genetic family resemblance exists among blood relatives. When the genetic profiles were compared, examiners concluded that the blood found on all of the evidence had originated from Shirley Duguay. Though the 32-year-old mother's whereabouts remained uncertain, all the evidence suggested she had been the victim of a violent crime. Police on Canada's Prince Edward Island continued searching for missing 32-year-old mother of 5, Shirley Duguay. Though efforts to find her had gone unsuccessful, authorities had found clues suggesting she had met with a violent fate. Among them was a man's jacket, found stained with blood that had originated from Shirley. Looking for clues as to who might want to harm the young mother, officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police questioned Shirley's friends. They all believed that Shirley's ex-husband, Doug Beamish, was somehow involved in the disappearance. Recently, Shirley had started dating again. That had enraged her possessive and jealous ex-husband. And Doug Beamish had a history of violence.
When was the last time you saw those guys?
But the friend didn't recall if Beamish owned a jacket like the one found with Shirley's blood on it. Doug Beamish was emerging as the prime suspect in Shirley Duguay's disappearance.
Andre's down with the IN guys right now looking.
But so far, investigators had no physical evidence to prove it.
But, you know, without that jacket, being able to tie it to someone we don't have much. Andre, how did you make out with
Then they got a break.
We've got something. IDAM just came back. They found some white cat hair on the inside of the jacket. And all I could think about all the way down here was Beamish and his white cat in his house.
That was all RCMP Inspector Alphonse McNeil needed to hear.
We knew that he had a white cat, and there were white hairs in the jacket. So the process then was to find a lab that could examine these if we were able to seize blood from the cat.
With a warrant in hand, police and a local veterinarian returned to Doug Beamish's house. The suspect continued to deny any involvement in Shirley's disappearance and claimed that he didn't own a jacket like the one stained with her blood.
The veterinarian here is going to take him and take some blood.
Though it seemed like a long shot, authorities took possession of his cat, Snowball, hopeful they could somehow establish a genetic link to the hair found on the blood-stained jacket. Blood and hair samples were collected from Beamish's cat. But now, investigators had to find someone who was an expert in analyzing cat DNA. At the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland, they found one. There, biologist Dr. Stephen O'Brien has looked to the feline genetic code for help in medical research. When contacted, he agreed to help Canadian police. But Dr. O'Brien and his team never imagined that by cracking the feline genetic code, they might also help crack a baffling criminal case. The request to match a cat's DNA was unique in medical and legal history. First, examiners generated a genetic profile of the white hair pulled from the bloody jacket. Once completed, the results were then compared to the profile generated from the samples taken from Snowball.
What we discovered was that the genotype was identical to what we had seen in the jacket hair. So we were pretty sure that the jacket hair had come from a cat which had the same genotype as Snowball.
Though the scientists felt confident about the results, they could not be absolutely certain of them. It was possible that the few thousand cats roaming on the isolated Prince Edward Island shared a common ancestry. To find out, biologists needed to generate more DNA profiles of other cats on the island.
We had to determine what the status of the population was so that we could make the calculation of how likely it was that we were wrong in pronouncing a match.
Examiners went to work developing the genetic profiles of 20 randomly selected cats on the island. When O'Brien compared the results, he found that none shared a DNA signature similar to Snowball's. In fact, the odds that the hair found on the jacket had not come from Beamish's cat were 45 million to 1. Through Snowball, authorities had established a link between Doug Beamish and a jacket stained with his ex-wife's blood. But Inspector Alphonse McNeil wasn't satisfied.
You step it 1 foot at a time.
Next, he obtained a warrant to collect impressions of the suspect's feet.
Good. Just step it 1 foot at a time.
Now, he hoped to tie the suspect to the pair of white running shoes found with the jacket.
We thought, well, if we can put those running shoes on the feet of Douglas Beamish somehow, that would be pretty solid evidence besides his cat.
Dr. Keith Bettles, a forensic podiatrist, received the evidence. He began by creating plaster casts of the suspect's feet in order to reveal all of the unique characteristics.
People's feet are unique because we walk on them all the time. We have lots of different stresses, lots of different forces on our feet. Feet are practically as individual as fingerprints.
The casts of Beamish's feet lined up perfectly with all of the wear patterns observed on the insoles of the white shoes. A single strand of cat hair and a discarded pair of shoes had given investigators the evidence they needed to implicate Doug Beamish in the disappearance of his ex-common-law wife. Then, 7 months after Shirley Duguay went missing, badly decomposed human remains were discovered buried in a remote wooded area. Dental records later confirmed that the victim was Shirley Duguay. And the medical examiner classified her death as a homicide. A short while later, Douglas Beamish was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators believe that Beamish couldn't handle Shirley Duguay dating other men. Somehow, he manipulated her into giving him a ride in her car and directed her to a remote spot. Once there, he beat his ex-common-law wife to death. He then buried her body in a remote area and abandoned the car. Douglas Beamish was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. No place is immune from violent crime. And even the friendliest towns have their problems. Mansfield, Ohio has been called one of America's most livable cities, which makes what happened here all the more surprising. On January 2nd, 1990, a woman came in to speak with Mansfield police.
Yes, ma'am. What can I do for you?
She was concerned that something had happened to her friend, 44-year-old Noreen Boyle. When she last saw her friend a few days earlier, Noreen was shaken and visibly upset. Her marriage of more than 22 years was falling apart. And not only was her husband moving nearly 200 miles away to Erie, Pennsylvania, but he would likely take the couple's 2 children with him. Noreen was devastated. When she tried to contact her, Noreen's husband, a prominent local physician, said Noreen had packed up and left town after a fight. But the friend couldn't believe that Noreen would walk out on her 2 children. Mansfield police agreed to look into the case. And their first step was to question Noreen's husband, Dr. John Boyle. When Lieutenant David Messmore arrived at the residence, he learned that John Boyle was out of town. John Boyle's mother explained that he had driven to Erie, Pennsylvania a few days earlier, where he was opening up his new medical practice. He was due back later that evening. When questioned, she said that Noreen walked out on the family a few days earlier, and she was watching the couple's children until her son John returned home. The woman excused herself to check on the Boyles' baby daughter. Then, the couple's son approached the detective.
My mom would never do something like that.
He said he was afraid something bad had happened to his mother. But before he could explain, his grandmother returned.
I'm really sorry. I have no more information.
When she saw what was happening, she ended the interview and asked the detective to leave.
I really have nothing more to tell you. I really need to have you leave.
The encounter troubled police.
He's from Mansfield.
And Lieutenant Messmore couldn't ignore that Dr. Boyle had left town around the same time his wife was reported missing.
I'm not sure where it's at.
But he soon learned that the reason for the doctor's trip to Pennsylvania checked out.
He had been hired by a very large medical corporation in Erie, Pennsylvania. So he was basically traveling back and forth between Mansfield and Erie for some period of time.
But where was Noreen Boyle? Later that evening, Detective Messmore returned to the residence. His visit had been anticipated. Dr. Boyle's lawyer answered the door.
Charlie. You represent Dr. Boyle? I do. Oh, okay. Is he home right now?
Well, his client had in fact returned home from Pennsylvania. But because of the strain caused by the impending divorce, Dr. Boyle did not wish to discuss Noreen with police.
All right, well, I'll get with you later.
It wasn't the response investigators expected.
I was somewhat stunned that in the event of a missing person in your family, you would hire an attorney to represent you when there's no accusations or even any allegations of wrongdoing or or even criminal matters involving the family. So that was certainly a very unusual situation.
I was not the only nurse.
To find out what Dr. Boyle might be trying to hide, police questioned his friends and co-workers. Professionally, all agreed Dr. Boyle had an impeccable reputation. But personally, he was known to be a womanizer and rumored to be involved in numerous affairs. In fact, one of his alleged mistresses was pregnant. And everyone speculated that the child belonged to Dr. Boyle. Though that made him a bad husband, it didn't mean he was capable of physical violence. In fact, only one person seemed to believe otherwise, and that was the Boyle son. Concerned for the child's well-being, Lieutenant Messmore caught up with him after school. The child was eager to tell his story. He said that the night before his mom disappeared, the sound of his parents arguing outside his bedroom woke him up.
I heard a big thump on the wall.
He heard a loud
And my
thud,
dad came,
and then there was
slowly
silence.
checking if I was sleeping.
A few seconds later, his dad peeked into his room. The boy was afraid and pretended to be asleep. The next morning, his mom was gone. His dad told him that she packed up and left. But he didn't believe his mom would leave without saying goodbye.
Did you have a conversation with your dad at all?
Though police had no evidence that a crime had been committed, they began to theorize that the noise heard by the child might have been the sound of his own mother being assaulted, or worse. Police in Mansfield, Ohio continued their search for missing mother of two, Noreen Boyle. And now they theorized that her husband, Dr. John Boyle, was somehow involved. Though police had no hard evidence that a crime had taken place, they were able to obtain a warrant to search the Boyles' Ohio residence. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts to the proteins found in blood, technicians began scouring the house. But their efforts failed to turn up any evidence of a violent crime. Still, investigators persisted. To learn more, they contacted authorities in Erie, Pennsylvania, where Dr. Boyle was setting up his new medical practice.
Hi, Mill Creek Township Police Department.
Pennsylvania detectives tracked down a real estate agent there who had recently sold a house to Dr. Boyle and a pregnant woman who introduced herself as his wife. She recalled that Dr. Boyle was particularly interested in the home's concrete basement floor. He said he was eager to tear it up in order to build a playroom for his children. He offered to pay the asking price as long as he could take possession of the house immediately. The real estate agent turned over the sales agreement, which was signed by both the doctor and his wife. Pennsylvania authorities forwarded a copy to Mansfield Police Lieutenant David Messmore.
In that copy, it was noted that Dr. Boyle signed it, and also an N. Sherry Boyle. And checking further into the background, it was quite obvious that Noreen's name was not Sherry for a middle name.
Dr. Boyle had purchased the home with a woman pretending to be his wife. Investigators subpoenaed the suspect's most recent credit card statements. They learned that he had used his card to rent a jackhammer and to purchase indoor-outdoor carpeting and a load of concrete. Suddenly, all of the pieces were adding up.
I had the feeling and very strong suspicion that the body would be in that location.
Pennsylvania authorities issued a warrant to search the basement of Dr. Boyle's new home. Beneath some shelving and the indoor-outdoor carpeting, they found a badly poured patch of concrete. It was roughly the size of a makeshift grave. A crew was called in to dig up the concrete floor. After some time, they recognized the unmistakable smell of a decaying body. Then, a few feet down, they discovered a tarp. And inside were the badly decomposed remains of a human body. After carefully excavating the grave, the remains were transported to the medical examiner's office. A watch and other pieces of jewelry worn by the victim matched the description of those worn by Noreen Boyle. And dental records confirmed that the victim was, in fact, the 44-year-old mother of two. Noreen had been savagely murdered.
Looking for Dr. Boyle?
On January 26, 1990, almost a month after his wife disappeared, Dr. John Boyle was arrested in Ohio for suspicion of killing Noreen. Despite the evidence against him, the doctor maintained his innocence.
Okay, sir.
Someone was trying to frame him. That seemed ridiculous to investigators. But to ensure a conviction, they needed an eyewitness or physical evidence directly linking him to the homicide. And so far, they had neither. It was possible that Dr. Boyle could get away with murder. But then, nearly a week after Dr. John Boyle's arrest, a Mansfield, Ohio resident made a strange discovery. A pile of concrete had been dumped on the remote property. The field was nearly 200 miles away from where Noreen Boyle's body had been unearthed. But the man had followed the case in the media and thought there might be a connection. A crime scene technician was dispatched to the scene. After photographing the area, the concrete was collected into evidence. Police later determined that the property was owned by a close friend of Dr. Boyle's. The doctor had been there on numerous occasions. But to prove murder, police now needed to show that the concrete found in Ohio had originated in the suspect's Pennsylvania home. Police had found missing 44-year-old Noreen Boyle buried in the basement of her husband's new Pennsylvania home. Though investigators had a strong circumstantial case against her husband, they hoped a pile of concrete found in an Ohio field could physically link him to the murder. The samples collected from the field, along with concrete taken from the crime scene, were sent to CTL Engineering in Columbus, Ohio. There, lab supervisor Larry Piscitelli is an expert in analyzing the microscopic nature of rocks and concrete. Without being told where the individual samples had come from, he was asked to determine if any of the concrete pieces had originated from the same source. To analyze the internal structure of the concrete, the samples are cut into cross-sectional pieces using a diamond-tipped saw. Once completed, the surfaces are smoothed and polished. Then, Piscitelli subjected the evidence to a high-powered microscope. Concrete is a mixture of stones, gravel, and sand, called aggregate, bound together by a cement paste and some trapped air. With the help of a computer, Piscitelli measures and counts each of these components. To the average eye, all concrete looks pretty much alike. But in fact, each chunk has a unique story.
Each piece of concrete is usually different because the components vary slightly. Even if they come from the same load of concrete, two different samples from the same truckload can be different because the percentages of the air voids, the small entrained or entrapped air voids, can be slightly different.
Piscitelli was unable to find significant similarities between most of the samples. But when he analyzed the results, he found that two of the pieces stood out from the rest. They shared the exact same number of unique components.
These two pieces of concrete had some unique characteristics that were peculiar just to those two pieces of concrete, and based on all the data and analysis, the numbers being exactly the same, I was able to show that those two pieces of concrete came from the same structure.
Of the two samples that matched, one had come from the pile of rubble found in Mansfield, Ohio. The other was collected in the basement of the suspect's new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. Police now had enough to charge Dr. John Boyle with murder. Police believe that John Boyle murdered his wife in the couple's home in order to start a new life with his pregnant mistress. After the kill, he drove her body to Pennsylvania and buried her in a grave he had dug in the basement of his new home. Investigators theorize he then returned to Ohio and dumped the leftover concrete on his friend's property. Dr. John Boyle was convicted of aggravated murder and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. John Boyle thought he'd buried all evidence of his crime. But in fact, the trail of evidence spanned 200 miles. Other murders are more local, but the road to solving them can be just as long. In Harrison County, Missouri, on June 26, 1995, a farmer out for a walk noticed a foul odor. At first, he thought that maybe one of his livestock had died. But the reality was much worse. Hidden among some overgrowth lay the lifeless body of a man. After receiving the 911 call, dispatchers contacted officers of the Major Case Squad, a group of law enforcement personnel from several neighboring jurisdictions. Bethany Police Chief George Martz was among the first to respond to the scene.
We had no idea when we arrived who the victim was. There was no identification on the body that we were able to determine at that time.
But the manner in which he died was clear. He had been shot several times. Police recovered an empty box of ammunition. And a few feet away, they found several spent shotgun shell casings. Then, Sheriff Greg Kuhn from the nearby Grundy County Sheriff's Department arrived at the location. He believed he recognized the victim as a local resident by the name of Al Pinniger.
After I looked at the body, I felt that it might have been Al Pinniger, who I had dealt with in the past in Grundy County. Really couldn't tell for sure, but it just appeared to me that might be who it was.
Unsure what was evidence and what was roadside trash, investigators collected numerous items scattered around the area. They found and collected a small plastic clock. On the back was torn adhesive with tiny synthetic fibers clinging to it. They also located a single strand of brown leather lying in the middle of the road. Police hoped that somewhere among the debris were clues that could explain this brutal murder. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim had died as a result of several 12-gauge shotgun blasts. He'd been shot twice in the back and once in the face. The victim's fingerprints were lifted and then passed on to Harrison County Police. Investigators requested Al Pinniger's fingerprint card, which was on file in Grundy County. When they compared those prints with the ones taken from the homicide victim, they found a perfect match. Now, detectives from the Major Case Squad had to figure out who wanted Al Pinniger dead.
Major Case Squad.
Soon, they got their first break.
Okay, when did she report him missing?
Police learned that the victim had been reported missing a few days before his body was discovered.
Okay, thanks for calling.
And the report had been filed by his fiancée. Police immediately arranged for an interview. The victim's fiancée told detectives that she and Al had been living together for some time. She said that she last saw him a few hours before he went missing.
You need anything from the store?
She had left the house to go run a few errands.
All right, I'll see you later.
Al said he was going to cut the grass and do some work around the house. He hadn't mentioned any plans to leave that day.
5 days ago.
Recently, she had been trying to help him overcome a drug problem. He had been doing his best to stay far away from his drug-dealing friends.
John Middleton and
Usually stay in the middle of the lawn or with the grass.
She suspected, however, that he had seen some of them that day. When she returned home later that afternoon, she passed a pickup truck coming out of her neighborhood. She didn't see Al in the truck, but she knew the vehicle belonged to a couple that he used to deal drugs with.
So he's been dealing with drugs?
She believed Al may have been ducking down to avoid being seen.
when I was driving.
When the fiancé arrived home, she discovered that Al and his 12-gauge shotgun were gone. The information provided police with their first real lead.
Okay, guys, here's what we got.
They ran a background check on the couple, identified as John Middleton and his girlfriend, Maggie Hodges.
Decomposed. You and Rodney.
Middleton had an extensive criminal record, mostly involving drug-related offenses. To find out why he may have wanted to harm Al Pinniger, police tracked down Middleton's known associates. One informant described Middleton as an extremely unstable and violent person.
Hodges and Middleton.
He said that as a result of police efforts to crack down on local drug dealers, John Middleton had become increasingly paranoid. He threatened to kill people he did business with if he found out they were cooperating with authorities. No one doubted him for a minute. Everyone was afraid of him. All of the information led police to suspect that Middleton's paranoia had likely led to the murder of Al Pinniger. And they hoped that somewhere among the shotgun shells and the assorted litter collected from the crime scene was the means to prove it. Police in Harrison County, Missouri believed that a local drug dealer and his girlfriend were responsible for the brutal shotgun slaying of 29-year-old Alfred Pinniger. To prove it, investigators needed to physically link the suspects to the crime scene. Though several potential clues had been found there, an empty box of shotgun shells looked to be the most promising lead. A price sticker found on the box led investigators to the store where the ammo had originated. An employee there pulled recent sales records. According to receipts, several boxes of shells were bought on the day of the murder. The clerk recalled that 2 men and a woman had come in together to make the purchases.
Three of them, I remember.
But she also remembered something else.
Before and when they came back.
A few hours after the purchase, 2 of the 3 customers returned to the store. They had unused cartridges and wanted to return them for a refund. The clerk didn't recall seeing the other man who had been in with them earlier. When shown photographs, she picked out Al Pinniger, John Middleton, and Maggie Hodges as the 3 who bought the boxes of ammo earlier that day.
Did she come back the second time?
Yeah.
And she identified Middleton and Hodges as the 2 who came back to return the unused ammo. Though the evidence didn't prove murder, it was enough for police to obtain arrest warrants. Believing that Middleton and his girlfriend were capable of great violence, police cautiously approached the house they shared together. John Middleton was quickly subdued. Moments later, Maggie Hodges was also taken into custody. After the suspects were removed from the scene, police began searching for proof of murder. Inside Middleton's pickup truck, they collected a fringed brown leather jacket. As the search continued, technicians found a potential clue. Bethany Police Chief George Martz.
We took a piece of the dashboard from the Middleton truck that had a sticky substance on it, and on that sticky substance were fibers. Those fibers appeared to match the clock we found at the crime scene. So we removed a piece of the dash, the entire dash, and sent that to the lab for analysis.
All of the evidence was forwarded to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, located in Jefferson City. There, criminalist Kathleen Green worked the case. Almost immediately, she noticed that the fringes on the brown leather jacket appeared identical to a piece of brown leather found at the crime scene.
I looked at the jacket to see if there was any fringe missing from it, and did find an area where there was a piece of fringe missing. I then compared the question end of the fringe to the question area on the jacket to determine if it was originally attached to it.
Though the pieces lined up well, Green was unable to conclusively state that the piece of leather had in fact come from Middleton's jacket. She turned her attention to the stick-on clock found near Al Pinniger's body. When she compared the adhesive on the back of the clock to the adhesive stuck to Middleton's dashboard, she found numerous similarities.
It was the same size, it had the same coloring, they were both made of the same type of material.
When the torn edges of the 2 pieces were placed side by side under a comparison microscope, examiners found a match. Next, fibers found on the stick-on clock were compared to carpet samples collected from the vehicle. Criminalist Jenny Smith found one consistency after another.
We determined that the fiber from the clock face, this would have been considered the question fiber, was similar in physical and chemical composition to the fiber from the suspect vehicle. Therefore, we would conclude that this fiber, question fiber, could have come from this vehicle.
When confronted with the evidence, Middleton was uncooperative.
This is your opportunity to tell your side of the story. We know what story.
But his resistance didn't matter. Police had pieced together the motive behind the murder.
You think about this real long.
My belief is that Mr. Middleton thought Alfred Pinniger was about to rat him out to the police department and to law enforcement authorities, and Mr. Middleton was not going to allow that to happen. You're in some bad trouble.
But Middleton was wrong.
John, this is
The victim had made no attempt to contact authorities. Police believe that on the day of the murder, John Middleton and Maggie Hodges drove to Al Pinniger's house. They asked him to go target shooting, and he agreed. What he didn't know was that he was the intended target. At some point, however, that became clear. A scuffle started inside the car. Pinniger escaped, but he didn't get far. John Middleton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Maggie Hodges pled guilty and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. It takes motive and opportunity to commit a murder. And it takes hard evidence to solve one. When clues are few, forensics experts provide the know-how to turn the most ordinary object into a material witness.